I am looking forward to a tremendous program today, and I'm glad all of you have joined us. First, I'd like to thank a few people who made this possible: the Marriage Center for Environmental Studies, the Business Law and Policy Forum, the Richmond Environmental Law Society, and the International Law Society for their support. All right, with that being said, let's get started with the program. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has created a serious humanitarian and geopolitical crisis, but the ongoing war also threatens the energy security of European nations. Many questions have been raised about this situation. Should European nations terminate the supply of natural gas and or oil from Russia now or in the near future? Could they? What are the legal responses for being more independent from Russian energy? Could European nations become more independent from Russia in the short and long term? And what might that entail, including consideration of possible alternative supply channels? Finally, could Europe do more and more quickly on the ongoing energy transition to move away from gas and oil much faster by speeding up development of renewable energy and taking other actions? At this extraordinary moment in history, coming to grips with these issues is an essential part of the response to the Russian invasion. But what should and could be done is no simple matter. Fortunately, we have with us here today two of Europe's premier experts on energy law to help us tackle these complex questions. Catherine Banet is an associate professor at the Scandinavian Institute of Maritime Law, head of the Department of Energy and Resources Law at the University of Oslo in Norway. Her interests, research, and publishing record are absolutely remarkable for their breadth and depth. Her work focuses on renewable energy, support schemes and alternative financing models, energy market design, infrastructure regulation, climate change mitigation, offshore wind and hydrogen regulation. She has background from private law practice, the European Commission, US diplomatic mission, and of course from academia. Michael Fehling holds the chair of public law and comparative law at the Bucerius Law School in Hamburg, Germany. He has a wide-ranging research agenda that gives him a unique perspective on the issues we'll discuss today. Like Catherine, Michael is actively involved in research and publishing related to the energy transition in the EU and its member states. He's also widely recognized for his work on economic regulation and administrative law from a European perspective, and particularly reform of public services and regulation of network industries. I personally can think of no one better placed to help us understand these issues than Catherine and Michael, and I am extraordinarily pleased to have them with us here today. We'll hear from each of them in turn, followed by a discussion of the measures that Europe could be taking in this moment. If you have questions that you would like them to consider, please type them in the Q&A box and I will make sure to pass that along. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Catherine, to get us started.
Well, thank you very much, Joel. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for the nice introduction, and very pleased as well to be a speaker together with Michael. So let me share some slides to kick off this presentation. And what I would like to do is, do you see the notes or need a full screen?
Yeah, could you swap with presenter view? Yeah.
It's better now?
That's great. Thank you.
Very good. Yes. What I would like to do is to stress some relevant factual and conceptual background elements to start with, and look more in detail the existing tools under EU energy law that have been triggered, and put that in perspective with the secondary legislation that is under revision, and to see how much novelty we can see in the short-term measures announced notably by the European Commission to answer the challenges caused by the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces. I would like to challenge you a bit to think about the big picture On the left side, you see some of the factual elements that challenging today's energy system. And we have indeed a combination of crises and different sources of disruptions that may not require the same elements, the same measures to be addressed. So we have a situation of high energy prices during this winter. 2 years ago, we talked about too low energy prices in the energy sector, but situation has changed. Then we have the consequences of climate change that are now happening, but that will increase, and we are in the decade to act. Then we have risks related to cybersecurity. We have the consequences for different actors in the energy system of extreme weather events. We have wars and terrorist attacks, and we have access to strategic raw materials that also are underpinning the energy transition. But we need to move, and we need to be more resilient in terms of socio-ecological systems. We need to develop a low carbon energy system to ensure energy independence. That is central to today's webinar. And we also need to protect consumers and to ensure that we have growth as well for industries, affordable energy prices that challenges the market design, as we know, for the energy system. And we need to build solidarity with partners that we deem reliable. And that is about shaping the new energy model. We're talking about the EU today, but that applies to many countries in the world. And we see that in doing that, with those different sources of disruption and different pricing happening from time to time, we are, and the EU is very much balancing and rebalancing what has been known for a long time as the trilemma, the energy trilemma. At the same time that it needs to monitor its governance system around what is the energy union, its 5 pillars, and the move for implementation of the European Green Deal. For those not familiar with the energy trilemma, it's structured around 3 main pillars, sometimes called Moscow, Paris, and Lisbon. So Moscow is security of supply, Paris is for the Paris Agreement, so sustainability and climate, and equity is Lisbon due to the agenda, economic agenda in Lisbon. So this is framing the discussion, but as well framing the manner the European Commission is monitoring the implementation of its energy union. That is structured around those 3 pillars, but as well include innovation and energy efficiency, integration of the energy market. This monitoring is primarily structured through the governance system with an annual state of the energy union. And that includes issue of security of supply that I will review under secondary legislation. And we have those national energy and climate plans that the member states put forward to the assessment of the European Commission. I think Michael will come back to the question of competences and legal basis under the treaty, but that's for sure that is an important legal frame to know what the European Commission can actually propose in terms of initiative and how far it can go in terms of coordination of actions. If we look now at the existing tools under EU energy law, I would like to really stress, and I think it will be obvious when going through those measures, that ensuring security of energy supply, and that is what is key as well in the situation with Ukraine now, and particular securing security of supply towards imports of gas, that is already a heavy trend over the past 2 decades in EU policy, but as well in terms of EU legal mechanisms. That starts by competition law. The European Commission has been key because it has competences in the sector to use competition law, in particular to address vertical issues in gas supply agreements. That means addressing any territorial sale restrictions in long-term supply agreements, any restriction on use, territorial restriction on exports, what is called destination clauses or exclusivity clauses. And for that, it has applied Article 101 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union that relates to anti-competitive agreements between businesses. And it has been doing that already for quite a long time, since we have a series of cases on Russian gas, but we have as well Algerian gas or Nigerian gas cases. But concerning Russian gas, we already have some decisions made by the European Commission. Investigation started already in 2003 against Gazprom, again 2005 Gazprom, and lately 2015 a statement of objection sent to Gazprom for alleged abuse of dominant position, this time on Central and Eastern European gas supply market. And that was contrary to EU antitrust rules. So competition law remains a powerful tool for addressing the negative effects of the position of those third-party companies, primarily from Russia, on the EU market. Then we have secondary legislation, and I would like to point out three central pieces that reflect as well the concerns related to third countries' imports, and that's primarily Russia. The first one is the system of intergovernmental agreements. It's based on a previous decision that has been updated, and that establishes an information exchange mechanism when a member state in the EU intends to conclude an intergovernmental agreement with a third party, a third state. And then it has to notify the European Commission that will assess whether there is any provision in that agreement that is contrary to the interests of the European Union and to competition law and to harmonized legislation. For gas, that notification is made mandatory, not for electricity yet. Then we have the gas directive that is from 2009, and it defines a series of legal mechanisms to ensure energy solidarity for security of supply purposes, among other things. And notably, there is an article on regional solidarity, where the member states shall cooperate in order to promote regional bilateral solidarity, and that includes as well the conclusion of some solidarity agreements already in circumstances of emergency. Then we have the security of gas supply regulation that targets specifically security of gas supply, and it has been updated in 2016. And that was also the starting point for a dispute before the WTO by the Russian Federation that challenged the changes made, notably to the unbundling legislation and to the 10E regulation, so transport infrastructures, third-party access, tariff setting. And the final panel report was issued in August 2018. When we look now at the regulatory legislation that is under revision, we need to look at the package that has been put forward in December 2021, and that intends to revise notably the gas directive and the gas regulation. That is called the hydrogen and decarbonized gas packages. I would like to pinpoint here the measures that I think the most interesting for today's discussion. There are proposals in terms of more effective and coordinated use of storage, operational solidarity arrangements between the member states. So it echoes what was already in the gas directive and regulation. The member states would be required to make storages part of their security and supply risk assessments that they have to elaborate. And that also includes risk linked to the control of storage by entities from third countries. This is key to assess because third countries may have a tendency to weaken the level of storage in Europe, and that's a source of vulnerability. Then there are proposals as to the conclusion of voluntary joint procurement of gas strategic stocks in case of emergency. The member states also encouraged to conclude bilateral solidarity agreements in terms of crisis. There are provisions proposed for increasing the transparency of gas supply contracts. That has been an issue in Europe and other regions as well, but relation to the formula for price setting and the revision of some of the gas supply contracts. So here, the European Commission is proposing more transparency on price formation. They also propose that the ACER, the Agency for Cooperation between Energy Regulators, and the committee in charge of energy securities to advise on whether those transactions in gas supply contracts and gas derivatives should be subject to a system of pre or post-trade transparency requirements. And finally, they also proposed to the member states or regulatory authorities to develop interruptible supply contracts. So here providing even more flexibility in the revision of the gas supply contracts. And finally, they also proposed to phase out unabated fossil gas, that means without capturing the CO2, and not permitting having long-term contracts for supply of those fossil gases beyond 2049. If we look at the short-term measures that have been announced, and I could not resist to use a green cap for this one, based on two communications, we have the Repower EU communication, and we have a shorter, more recent proposal on gas storage, and that will be the basis for further legislative proposals. The objectives of all those communications, when we put that together, is to diversify gas supplies through LNG, through more pipelines with a third party that we trust, but as well to diversify gas supplies in terms of types of gas, biomethane or hydrogen, green hydrogen notably. Then it's also to accelerate the rollout of green energy technologies in all sectors, including in the building sector, so being less dependent as well to the use of fossil fuels in different sectors. And finally, to reduce energy demand, boost energy efficiency, and mitigate retail prices. So the trilemma is still valid. When we look at the measures proposed, and that's the short-term measures, we find elements related to retail price mitigation. So still, and that concerns price regulation, the possibility to regulate retail prices. There as well a possibility for member states to finance some short-term relief measures. So that's an issue of state aid law. Then they also come back to the EU gas storage strategy. So gas storage is very critical for Europe before the next winter. We have to act now because we're going towards the summer, but next winter will be critical. Here, the European Commission proposes to define storage, gas storage as critical infrastructure. So that's a specific regime, more protective regime. They also, again, come back to the issue of ownership risks with a system of certification by the regulatory authorities when the gas storage facility is owned by third countries. There are obligations proposed for minimum gas storage, smart use of existing infrastructures, mechanism to allocate security of supply costs between the member states, and as well to develop more public support, financial support to suppliers, for example, in the form of guarantees, and that's another example, a two-way contract for difference. The European Commission is also proposing to take the role of coordination for refilling operations through joint procurement of gas, collective orders, and matching supplies. So for those having been working with gas supply agreements for a long time, it's a bit surprising that now we are back to joint purchase, joint negotiation, but it's a voluntary mechanism that is proposed. The European Commission is also proposing to establish a joint European platform for contractualization of gas supply based on bilateral negotiation with major producers. So it will be negotiating with those different suppliers. Then interconnectors are recognized as key to build solidarity and as well security of supply for the member states. And therefore, we need new infrastructures that also should be hydrogen compatible for the future. And finally, what has been lately announced is to end coal purchase from Russia. the European Commission, the EU, and the EU member states cannot agree yet on a full phase out end of gas purchase from Russia, because Europe is too dependent yet on that. But today, the president of the council, Michel, announced that it may be a solution that we need to adopt at the end. And what about strategic raw materials? Because many of them are also purchased from Russia. We'll end up here, and thank you for your attention.
Right. Oh, thanks so much. That's absolutely wonderful. Let's hear from Michael, and then just a reminder to everybody who's online with us and folks who are in the room, if you have questions for either Michael or Catherine or both, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and I will make sure that they get addressed. Michael, I'll turn it over to you. Yeah, oh, you're on mute. Michael, you're on mute. Tell him something.
So now it should work.
There you go. All right. Well, you need to start over from the beginning. You were on mute the whole time. There you go.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, the European Union pays around, I think, $1 billion a day for Russian natural gas, oil, and hard coal. And so the urgent question is, can we indirectly financing Putin's war by importing much more energy from Russia? That's the starting question. I think there are three different scenarios. First of all, the slow one, we could phase out such imports over a longer period of time. Then the hard one, that means immediately terminating such imports as a part of economic sanctions. And then it also may go the other way around, that Russia himself might terminate such imports as a part of economic countermeasures against Europe or Germany. On the other side, it's an immediate stop of energy imports from Russia, including gas, would pose a high risk to security of supply in the short run, because the EU and even more Germany are highly dependent on Russian natural gas, a bit less on coal and a bit less on oil. It's a great uncertainty about the concrete impact on the European and the German economy. There are estimated losses in Germany of up to 3% of the BIP or even higher, and more, some 100,000 jobs. And then the last major question, who can act, who shall act? That points to the unclear and difficult distribution of powers between the EU and the member states in this area of the law. Some factual background, you see the numbers about the dependence on Russian oil and gas and coal. It's bad in the EU, but it's even worse in Germany. And some details about infrastructure and markets. Oil and gas imports come from Russia mostly via pipeline. And these pipelines are running through Eastern Europe, most of them through the Ukraine too, to Germany. And Germany sits at the center of a net of gas pipelines running through Europe. And all this is a part of long-term private contracts between Russian companies for natural gas, mostly Gazprom, and European and German companies. There's also the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but this has been abandoned by the German government after the Russian invasion of Ukraine now. So that's no more an actual problem. Liquid natural gas, LNG, is of now only has a very small market share in Germany, a bit more in some other European countries. And there's also the problem, there is no LNG terminal in Germany yet. There are plans to build 3 of them, but that there is no license for this and nothing concrete. And the capacity for LNG in whole Europe might be sufficient, but it's also very difficult to buy enough LNG on the world market now. It might be possible, but in any case, prices would be extraordinarily high. Coming to storage capacity for natural gas in Germany, there is storage capacity, but the fill level is very low at the moment. So that will be a problem for the next winter, certainly. Green gas, that means green hydrogen, which shall substitute natural gas in the future, Catherine mentioned this already, is still in an infancy in the whole of Europe and does not yet play a relevant role. And summing up, it would be much easier to substitute Russian coal and oil, as these resources can be easily transported by ship. But it's also the problem that prices would increase significantly. Even so, if European countries would compete with each other on the world market for these resources. There's the ideas of a single buyer system that would be hardly compatible with WTO. That's another problem. And coming to the policy, the energy sector is not yet part of the sanctions, neither on national level nor on EU level. There is no EU policy on this yet. The ban on Russian hard coal is on the table. And in the short run, a ban on Russian oil seems to be more realistic than on natural gas, because for oil, there are alternative supply channels which are mostly lacking for natural gas. High German politicians, including the Chancellor Scholz and the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy, Habeck, announced that they considered it to be economically unfeasible to immediately stop energy imports from Russia. Yes, having a short look at the legal framework, that's Article 994 is the major provision for the distribution of powers between the EU and the member states in the energy sector. Catherine mentioned some other norms which are part of the competition problem, but now we do not face with a competition, but with a problem how to ensure security of energy supply, I think, in the first place. So that's the major provision of the treaty. And it's a shared competence. It's not an exclusive competence of the EU, but a competence shared with the member states. Several problems. First, I have highlighted the so-called solidarity clause. There are different readings of this clause. One can read it as an illustration of the independency between the national markets, but that would be no great thing. That's, I think, is self-evident. And there's the other reading, I think, that is more convincing, that we should read this as an attempt to create a corrective mechanism when markets fail to guarantee a security of supply. Then there would be EU competence. But there's a limit on EU competences. It's also highlighted that's the so-called sovereignty clause. It's the exclusive competence of the member states to determine the energy mix and so on. The major question is, when it comes to indirect effects on the energy mix, does this provision also applies for such indirect effects? And there's an ECJ, European Court of Justice ruling in the Poland case, in which the court points to the fact that indirect effects are not sufficient if the legislative measure aims at other, in this case, environmental goals. But it's not so clear whether this would also apply if the measure aims to ensure security of energy supply in the Union. So in the end, it's a very ambitious legal provision, and it's meant to be ambitious then because it's a political compromise. it could not be concrete, it could not be clear because the member states couldn't agree on a more concrete legal framework. Because we have long-term contracts between companies, not between states, if we would like to terminate these contracts, then we have to do it with foreign trade and trade law, and I have highlighted the provision in the German Foreign Trade and Payments Act. I think that would be not a great deal from the legal point of view. There is a clear legal basis to terminate the contracts if it is thought to be necessary to prevent a disturbance of the peaceful coexistence of nations. A few words about Nord Stream 2. I think you all have heard about this. Never-ending story, but the story has ended now. The German government always insisted that this is a purely commercial project, but that was never true. Certainly, it was had always a large political dimension. The major planning approval had already been issued by the competent German regulatory network agency, but there was a last license was still lacking, and the German government stopped the licensing procedure. So Nord Stream 2 is out, and I think it won't come back. I don't address minimum storage obligations or energy emergency plans for gas storage now because of the short time. I only give you a short look at this slide for options for becoming more independent from Russian energy. It's from the International Energy Agency. But maybe we can discuss this later on. And I only give you a short look at these special ideas for speeding up the energy transition in Germany. That's also, I think, for discussion maybe later on. Yes, some concluding remarks. In my opinion, it's an open question whether Putin's war will accelerate the energy transition in the EU and in Germany or slow it down, because we will have temporarily rely more on coal, shift from natural gas to coal, and that's, of course, even more relevant for emissions. And of course, the acceleration of the energy transition will cost an enormous amount of money. And the money, if we need the money to expand our military budget, in my opinion, that's a foolish idea, because it will not give us more security in a nuclear confrontation. Then this money will be lacking to spend on the energy transition. And the last issue, if we would terminate energy imports from Russia immediately, then a few days or weeks later, the question might arise, what's next? In my opinion, we should be cautious to already realize the full potential of economic sanctions, because then is nothing more to do if it becomes even worse, and it might become even worse in the Ukraine. And then there are only military options left, and that would be very, very risky. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that outstanding presentation. Let me, for the students who are here in the room with me are not logged into the webinar. So if anybody in here has a question, I'll be happy to pass it along. Questions in here? Steve, go ahead. Hang on 1 second, Michael. I've got to hear the question. And Catherine, I've got to hear the question first.
Yeah, I don't know whether this is their direct expertise, but what kind of emergency protocols are in place for energy in the event of a conventional general European war? Is it basically rationing, or is there some hope of getting it from the US or overseas and so on? Yeah.
All right, that's a really interesting question. The question from our student, Stephen Taft, is whether there is any sort of protocol in place right now to handle the situation of a complete disruption in supply by something akin to a conventional war in Europe itself. An interesting question.
Shall I answer, or do you want to answer, Catherine?
You can go ahead. That's fine.
Yes, I think you already mentioned this, Kathleen, in your presentation. There is a gas security regulation from 2010, and Article 8 of this gas security regulation, European regulation, calls for a national energy emergency plan. And there is, at least in Germany, there is such an emergency plan issued by the independent regulatory agency. And they already announced that they have to rewrite this emergency plan because of the new developments. I must confess that I'm not sure about the situation with coal and oil.
Just add that indeed in the regulation security of supply, we find the template for drafting those plans, and you have a list of risk, and you have political risk, including wars. Yeah, would be military civil wars. So it's part of this assessment and the template. So at least member states should have thought about it in terms of planning. And you have all the legislation related to critical infrastructures, and what the European Commission now is proposing is to include the energy storage, because it's so critical on the short term, into the definition of critical infrastructures. The risk related to as well to cyber attacks is something which is very much on the radar at the moment too. But those are, you have what is already in the legislation and what is proposed, and what is proposed will take time to be adopted, and we don't have time.
Yeah. Considering oil, there is a minimum storage obligation in German national law. It dates back from the old crisis from the 1970s, and there is a constitutional court decision about the constitutionality of this minimum storage obligations. And now we have plans both on national and on European level, maybe to introduce such a minimum storage obligation for gas too.
Other questions from here in the room?
We can hear you too, because they're stealing like so.
Yeah, I do it once.
All right, Professor Noah Sachs would like to ask a question. Go ahead.
Thank you both for your presentation today. And I'm wondering if you can each provide some historic perspective on the moves that Europe took to secure its gas or coal or oil supply in terms of Russia, back when Russia invaded Georgia, or back when Russia annexed Crimea. In other words, was Europe just asleep at the wheel back then? Should Europe have done more back then to secure its energy supply? Or maybe Europe did take steps?
Maybe I start, because that's the question which is most often, I think, given to Germany. And of course, you're right. There was a strong dependency on Russian gas since the 1980s, but this dependency even increased after the Crimea and so on. So it has been around 35%, and now it's around 50%. And of course, that was a political mistake. I think most people in Germany and most politicians in Germany will agree on this now. We always thought that, but I think we are not the only one. We always thought that strong economic ties will hinder Russia to become aggressive, because they don't want to risk these strong economic ties. And as it is shown now, that was a miscalculation. But in principle, I think it's a good thing to have such economic ties. It was too much, certainly. But if you think the other way around, if we would not have this economic ties now, then there would be no room for sanctions. And if there would be no room for economic sanctions, then the military option would become strong, and that's really risky. So I think it's a good thing to have strong economic ties. It was okay to have imports from natural gas and so on from Russia, but it has become too much even after the Russian aggressions 2008 and so on.
If I can add another perspective, I think that the European Union has been acting on security of supply consistently over the years, and we can see the adoption of those amendments to regulation amendment to directive reacting to direct threats from Russian companies, from Gazprom, to limit competition between European operators or the risk. So there has been a really reactive approach from the EU. At the same time that they have been also since the 1970s clear about the risk of security of supply. And maybe then they have not been careful enough. And when France decided to build up its nuclear energy capacity, that was also a reaction to that, to any threat regarding energy supply. But that was even before. What was some examples of the way the European Union has reacted to threats primarily from Russia? You have those references in the TFEU, the Treaty on Functioning of the European Union, notably Article 194 that Michael has presented, to solidarity. And the fact that solidarity was inserted and referred to so much in the treaty was a clear influence by the Eastern European countries, Poland, etc., based on the threat that Russian supply was imposing on them. So we see a new series of cases from the years 2000. So the European Union, the European Commission has tried to do that in a reactive way, to build momentum around solidarity that is now recognized as a principle by the case law. But still, sometimes you lack the momentum to really, because you have a position at the national level to have a real ambitious policy.
Other questions here in the room? All right, I'll ask the next question then. All right, Michael, you mentioned the, I guess, appalling prospect of having to turn to coal in the near term if Europe was going to reduce its imports of natural gas from Russia. Is there anything else that could be done in the short term? And maybe the answer is no, and we would want to divorce the short and long-term solutions from one another. Because I think, Catherine, you did a great job in your very first slide of outlining all the various different considerations we should be thinking about in the long term. But now what else could be done in the short term? And I want to make one other pitch here. One of my energy law colleagues at another US law school asked me before we came on this call about the prospect for demand reductions as part of a near-term solution. I guess I'm wondering if you could address that as one part of the answer to this question.
Sorry, I didn't understand the last thing you said.
Oh, I'm sorry. One of my American colleagues asked about the prospect of demand reduction, or as part of the answer to in the short term.
Yes.
I noticed the IEA slide has get people to voluntarily turn back their thermostats, but that's not the entire response that we could do if we were actually interested in.
But that's a big discussion, at least in Germany now. That's the idea to have, I can't say it in Fahrenheit, but 1 degree Celsius left room temperature. So reduce heating even in residential homes. That would considerably, only 1 degree, that would considerably lower the volume of gas we would need, because most heating in Germany is based on natural gas now. a little bit on oil, but most on natural gas. But if we want to reconstruct heating with heat pumps, and so on, then it's only possible in the long term. It's not possible in the short term. And the second discussion is a tempo limit on German Autobahnen. And you might know that the tempo limit on the street, speed limit, is a question which resembles the idea of gun restrictions in the US. So it's a real hot topic. From outside, maybe it's really difficult to understand. And frankly speaking, I do not understand it either. But in German politics, it's very important. And now many politicians, but not all of them, said we should have a speed limit on the freeways, on the Autobahn, because of reducing oil in cars. But of course, it's a little bit, but it's relevant. And it's one of the measures which wouldn't cost us too much money. And that's an advantage, at least.
We do in the.
Hold on a second. Okay, now you're unmuted.
I'm sorry, I was muted there for a second. Same question for you, Catherine. What could we do in the short term?
I would like to take both the European and Norwegian perspective, because they may not be the same. So European perspective, that's sure that decreasing your energy consumption, there was yesterday in France, RTE, the electricity TSO asked everybody not to start the washing machine in the morning because there are issues of supply, to be very, very concrete in your and careful in your energy consumption. Then we see that on the short term, they as well, although it's not big volumes, there will be a possibility for developing further decentralized energy generation, biomass, biomethane, particularly, that are available. And that's part of this long-term development, but that's also available on the short time, while you need to make sure that you fill the storages. And then the Norwegian perspective, that is pretty different. Because as you may know, Norway is not consuming any gas almost, except in the industry or for a generation on platforms offshore, and it relies primarily on electricity, and 95% of the energy mix is from hydropower. But the question has been, in that particular context, whether Norway could increase its supply of natural gas. That is already, it counts for 23% to the European Union. Of course, as Michael reminded, we're talking about commercial agreements. So it's not the state that dictates companies to increase the volume or decrease the volume. It's based on very careful assessments. But that's part of this special relationship between Norway and the rest and Europe in terms of delivery of gas to the European market, at the same time that they don't want to develop electricity interconnectors. So here we are in a very complex situation where we are part in Norway, although it's not an EU member state, to the internal energy market, so subject to the MEM rules. We have a clear possibility of supporting the needs in the European Union, but on the return, we are very careful in increasing that solidarity on the electricity side. So it's a very complex discussion at the moment.
I think the most urgent problem is the heating sector. With electricity, we have different sources to produce electricity. But at least in Germany, with the heating sector, we heavily rely on natural gas. And as far as I know, Catherine, please, maybe I'm wrong, but Norway said we can deliver a little bit more, but in natural gas, but only a little bit. So the German ministry tries to get more from Qatar and so on, but it's not so much. So it's 1% more, 2% more, and we have to replace at least 50%. That's the problem.
And you have climate considerations. We had 2 years ago a climate litigation case or constitutional litigation case, according to the side, related to the licensing awards. And there will be a question, do you continue licensing areas in order to have a stable source of gas supply and as well revenues from the state? Or in a climate perspective, you should reduce the fossil fuel production. Yeah, something happened in other countries in Europe. They say, well, we're supposed to close down coal facilities, but maybe we should not, because we need them for the next 1, 2, 3 years.
Other questions from here in the room? All right. Well, let me thank you both for truly outstanding presentations. It's really been eye-opening to learn about this landscape of the legal constraints and the policy options that stand before us in trying to address these really important issues. And on behalf of everybody who's here and everybody who's online, I really want to thank you very much for making this a terrific discussion. Thanks very much. And we'll look forward to keeping this conversation going. I know that I also have one American reporter who was here online who wanted to connect with the two of you, but I'll make that happen offline. All right. Thanks very much to both of you again.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.